Hi, I'm Mary Anna Mancuso, and welcome to Book Corner. Friends, I'm so glad that you're here. I'm really excited about today's conversation. Joining me is Aynne Kokas. She's the director of East Asia Center at the University of Virginia, and she's the author of Trafficking Data: How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. Anne, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Mary Anna. It's a pleasure to be here.
When I read your book, what I found most interesting is how data is extending beyond what we're sharing on social media. Oftentimes, people think that what you're sharing on social media, that's the only traffic of data that's being troved by everybody, and we're just giving it away for free. However, you mentioned that there's three levels of risk when it comes to data: personal, economic, and national security. Can you share how these levels of risks are being captured by both China and the United States?
Yeah, so this is a great question. When we think about data gathering, one of the things that people focus on is their personal data. So this kind of feeling of violation or discomfort that we get when we're being tracked or when we're being surveilled. But actually, what I argue in the book is that this is actually at the smallest level, one of the smallest risks that we face, because most people are not that interesting. So it's really, people who are very wealthy or who are very politically connected who become most important in that case. Now, what we also see is that there's economic competitiveness. So when companies like TikTok and companies like ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, are able to gather user data globally rather than, unlike companies like Meta or Google, which can't operate in China in the same way, they're able to outcompete local competitors. And what this means is that firms like TikTok are able to grow faster and become critical information infrastructure in the US. And then finally, there's this national security risk, which in the book I talk about as being related to questions of social media, but really it becomes even more significant in areas of health or agriculture or the Internet of Things, which impact our daily lives in an even more significant way.
Now, we're going to talk about health data, and I will tell you, I was pretty shocked about agricultural as well, but I'm going to leave that as a teaser for people to pick up and read the book. Can you discuss a little bit about the United States digital landscape versus the Chinese digital landscape and how they're vastly different one another, or how they actually are very similar?
So one thing that I think is important to note is the differing relationship between the private sector and government in China and the United States. So when we see something like a TikTok CEO being dragged in front of Congress, it's almost humorous. And in fact, my students actually laughed when I showed them the testimony because of the kind of ineffectual, bumbling ways that a lot of our members of Congress are interacting with tech CEOs, and the kind of seeming lack of knowledge, and also the fact that there was this significant testimony, but we haven't actually seen a lot of significant political movement. By contrast, in China, Jack Ma, one of the co-founders of Alibaba, which is one of China's largest tech firms, he made one critical comment following a speech by a Chinese regulator and disappeared for 3 months. This is a really different scenario. And when we're talking about whether or not Chinese tech CEOs or CEOs with operations in China would rather or feel more compelled to follow the regulations of the Chinese government versus the American government, it's pretty clear, because the pressure is very different. And it's not just pressure on CEOs themselves, but on their families, on their abilities to leave China, being forced to suspend their passports, impacts on their capital. So it's a really, really significant difference. The other thing that I think is important to note is the ways in which companies that gather significant amounts of user data gather it across sectors. So we're talking about the financial sector, the health sector, social, in ways that are even more comprehensive than we see here in the US. And the fact that those companies often have golden shares taken from them by the Chinese government. So a company like Tencent has the app WeChat, which is used to track people's movements. It was used to generate health codes during the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to people being locked down or not. But Tencent also is a government defense supplier, and the Chinese government owns shares in Tencent and has access to user data that way. So this is almost unthinkable within a U.S. context. Definitely, there's pressure that the U.S. government can exert on companies like Amazon and Google, but it's not at the same level. We couldn't see the U.S. Congress taking shares, for example, of Google or of Amazon and acting as the major shareholder. that wouldn't really work within our system.
No, it wouldn't. And you mentioned Google and Amazon and, Silicon Valley, it's become extremely powerful through extraction of user data, and users are unable to control or know where their data is being used. This is a problem, obviously. But when you point this out, most people push back and they cite that their profile is set to private. I say this to my friends all the time, like, you're just out here giving information about your kids' birthday parties, what you had for brunch, where you enjoy going, the movies you watch. Is there such a thing as privacy online?
Yeah, so this is really tricky. So you're essentially only being private. You're only not sharing your data with the public. You're still sharing your data with the company. And
Right.
especially in the case of companies like Meta or Google or Amazon, which aggregate huge amounts of user data across different sectors, they're able to develop really robust profiles of you. So I would say if it's something that you do genuinely want to keep private, you shouldn't share it. The other thing that's important to note is it's not just about those individual pieces of information. It's about the profile that can be generated about you across a wide range of different across a wide range of different platforms. It's also about how profiles of people like you can be generated to target ads, to target sales, to target mis and disinformation in political contexts.
Absolutely. And when I talk to my friends, we have conversations, and I always kind of tell them, one friend example tells me all the time that TikTok is the devil. And, oftentimes my other friends will say things like, well, I have a TikTok, but I don't ever post any videos. I just go on because I love watching the dances. I enjoy cat videos. But in your book, you actually mentioned mosaic theory. Can you share a little bit about what mosaic theory is, and how both the Chinese and the United States are using it to mine information and exploit data about users on TikTok and other social media platforms?
So mosaic theory is this idea that it's not just about individual pieces of information, but really about profiles that can be gathered from across a wide range of different areas. So when I'm talking about it in the Chinese context, I talk about it when we look at things like how TikTok can gather user data about you, your account, your biometrics, how you interact with different types of content, why you interact with certain types of content, when you do it, where you do it. So as well as all of the data that the app can gather from your phone, including things like passwords and that you may have saved on your phone. Now, this is significant, but it's also even more interesting when we look at things like TikTok's relationship with the Chinese government, the fact that it shares user data with parent company ByteDance, and even though the TikTok CEO said that they didn't, the terms of service allow TikTok to continue sharing the user data with its parent company and other subsidiaries. And then combining that with different types of user data from things like the Equifax hack, which was allegedly a Chinese government hack, the Target hack, also allegedly a Chinese government affiliated attack, the Marriott hack, which has information about how government employees travel, for example. So when we combine these pieces of information together, it becomes much more rich and provides much more sophisticated individual profiles.
So one of the things you mentioned is that there was we see Congress bringing these CEOs of tech companies in front of them. They do kind of like a dog and pony show about all of these interviews and asking all these tech questions. And elected officials, there was an opportunity to pass what was known as the American Data Privacy Protection Act. But elected officials, how can they say that they want to protect American interests from data that's being mined by the Chinese government when they're also taking in the data? I mean, look, elected officials are able to get elected by using social media data, by targeting voters, bringing in that information. So it almost seems as though it's kind of goes against their interests, but then they tell people that, oh, well, we want to protect your privacy and we're trying to get this done. How exactly is that going to take place? And do you see a path forward now that the American Data Privacy Protection Act was not passed?
So one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because I think that people need to understand how valuable their personal data is and all the different ways that it's used. So I'm really glad that you brought up that particular way. And the fact that it's involved in targeting products to us, in targeting specific political viewpoints, in targeting, specific viewpoints that we shouldn't be holding. So this is really significant. And there's actually what seemed like kind of low-hanging fruit from a data privacy and protection standpoint. A data broker, Senator Wyden introduced a Data Brokerage Act, which was an attempt to limit the sale of user data as a secondary markets. So basically, that Meta could sell your user data that it gathered from Facebook, and this has been rolling around Congress for years now, and it hasn't moved forward. And I think, you make a great point about the fact that it's very likely that a lot of members of Congress are benefiting from these data brokers and their ability to gather data about users. We also see a lot of members of Congress get significant financial contributions from tech companies that also benefit from user data gathering. So that's why it's really important for users to understand how their data is being exploited and gathered, and who has a benefit from not protecting them and advocating for themselves.
Now, in your book, you note that, quote, many of the tools firms use to gather data are convenient, they're fun, they seem harmless. In fact, they largely are harmless until they are not. You continue on to note that as with climate change, once the aggregate impacts of data trafficking shape new standards and norms, it becomes difficult to restructure global data flows. And when we talk about government data protection and you liken it to climate change because it needs public buy in, how can we get the public to buy in when it comes to securing our data, or are we too late?
So I'm an optimist. I think it is a tough moment that we're in right now, and it is very frustrating that with each passing day, it seems like there's another thing that you have to log into in order to be able to function in your everyday life. Um, but one of the things that I tell my students, and I think is shocking to many people, is that when a company goes bankrupt, their the user data that they've gathered can actually be used to help protect them from bankruptcy protection. It can be monetized, and it's an asset. And so we're essentially giving away assets to very wealthy tech companies. And I think that should incense a lot of people, especially a lot of, underemployed people in Gen Z and in the millennial generation who may be frustrated by things like, very high housing costs or very high inflation. Like, if you have assets, you shouldn't be giving them away. And you should be demanding that those assets be protected.
Right. No, absolutely. And you do cover a myriad of areas in which our data is being mined and shared, and people are just giving it away. If people are not going to do public outcry to elected officials to pass privacy data protections, how can citizens better protect themselves and protect their data?
So it's a great question. And there are, certain solutions that have been put forward have already been debunked. So things like password managers. I was using a password manager and LastPass got hacked. So that was quite frustrating. I know some people who just write down their passwords. I think the main point here is to really be mindful of which apps you're using and to try to limit access, limit the type of things that you're sharing online. And again, this is tough because it's a way that people socialize. I'm a media studies professor. It's a way that people build careers. A lot of our students go out and become influencers or digital marketing experts. And so this is really a significant area of growth in our economy. And I recognize this is tough, but I would urge people to try to keep, private things for themselves, particularly things like your, related to mental health or physical health, or, personal moments with your family. That's stuff that maybe you don't want to share. Your financial data, to the degree possible, be very judicious about who you're sharing that information with. And so maybe you need to share it with your bank or your hospital. But for example, a third party apps that are gathering data about your biometrics, maybe you don't need to participate on those apps.
That was actually probably the most surprising thing for me is in your book when you mention that health data has more potentially serious long-term impacts on our healthcare in context versus any other context in which we're sharing data. And I didn't, when I stopped to think about it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we're just giving all this information about our health. But can you share how health data can be weaponized in the future?
So one thing that I find to be completely unbelievable in this particular moment is that we have something called HIPAA, the Health Information Portability and Protection Act, but HIPAA only protects your interactions in a clinical setting, which means that any data that you share about your health is not protected if it's not in a clinical setting, which means if you're sharing your DNA with a commercial DNA testing company, they can sell and monetize that user data. And we've seen this happen in multiple cases. In the case of, for example, testing labs, where companies actually share their user data or share DNA with China's National Genomic Database, which is involved in the development of precision medical therapeutics, which is great. It's targeted ways to resolve and manage certain diseases, but can also be used in the reverse to target bioweapons. And this is a really complicated landscape. And one of the big challenges is when we're looking at things like DNA, it's not just impacting us now, it's not just impacting us in 10 years, it's impacting us generationally.
Now, one of the subtitle of your book, Trafficking Data, is that China is winning the battle for digital sovereignty. What is China's goal and how is it working to achieve this? And most importantly, is there a way that America can tamp back that and maybe win this war?
So one of the things that I think about when looking at this book is thinking about digital spaces as a new form of sovereign territory. And one of the things that's really interesting in terms of China's engagement in the world is we've seen this emphasis on kind of pushing the boundaries of new forms of sovereign territory that might not be particularly well regulated. So we've seen this in maritime spaces, we've seen this in space, and we're seeing it also in digital spaces. And one of the key factors here is that as China is defining a very robust and expansive vision of what constitutes the digital state, including tech companies that operate outside of China, including the digital actions of Chinese nationals outside of China, not necessarily with the consent of those people. We're also seeing a space where the US has for a very long time benefited from not defining what these borders are because it allows US tech companies to grow and expand. But by not defining what those borders are, now we're seeing in these interactions that the Chinese government can pressure Chinese firms to expand and grow and to gather data globally.
It seems like the Wild West out there. And in your book, you touch on everything from TikTok to Fitbits to sex tech to Roombas. What aspect or aspects of data trafficking troubles you the most? What's keeping you up at night?
So I would say that the health data is really the area where I really can't fathom the fact that we don't have better protections in the US, especially as different therapeutics and different potential bioweapons increase. And this is also really important when we look at the growth of things like AI and biohacking, and the fact that we're quite close to being able to have interactions between our neural networks and other technical networks, and we still don't have protections for what's happening in our brains and other kinds of healthcare data. So this starts to get a bit sci-fi, but it's not actually that far out. And when we think about the legislative process, which takes a very, very long time to move almost anything forward.
Absolutely. So, Anne, this has been a fantastic conversation. And before we go, I just want to know, what are you working on right now? Or is there a new book coming? What is it that we can look forward to and learning more about, what's going on with this kind of tug of war between our data?
So one of the things that I'm working on a visual version of this book designed for kind of younger audiences or maybe older audiences who don't have as much time to read long books these days. Because I think it's really important to expand public education in these areas. The other thing that I'm looking at is how US-China tech competition is affecting third countries like China, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, the European Union, Canada, and trying to see what that kind of global impact is. So I look forward to sharing it with you when it's done.
I can't wait to see that. I'm actually excited about both of those things. So make sure I get a copy and we can continue the conversation. So thank you so much, Anne. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to share this with your friends and family. And in the meantime, to see what's on my reading list, be sure to subscribe to the TopLine Substack and follow me at Twitter at Mary Anna Mancuso. Have a fantastic week and we'll chat soon.